right.
Now that's how it began. I was on it to the end. I was on it for the next 15 weeks.
So we brought Bill in, and he kind of went the final distance and really pulled that third act together and sort of Maximus' death to joining his family in the next life.
The script that I read was like a revenge movie. It was quite dark. The main character became very nihilistic. There was quite a lot of confusion in the plotting in the second half. And I know that Ridley and Doug and Walter wanted the plot sorted out, and they wanted the characters made more likable. I mean, that's not to say that they weren't likable, but they wanted more. And that's what I wanted. I mean, I'm not an action writer. You don't hire me to write fight sequences. The fight sequences were there. They were storyboarded. They were even starting to shoot them. My job was character and structure. The key thing I identified was, this is a story of a man who wants to kill somebody. And I personally don't want to go and see a movie about somebody who wants to kill somebody. I want to go and see a movie about somebody who loves somebody. And so I thought to myself, who does he love? Given that he's going to die at the end of the movie, that was the structure I inherited. Who does he love? He loves his wife and child. How can I create a plot for this story that means that his drive is to be with the people he loves rather than to slaughter a monster? The slaughtering of the monster is good, I'm not against that, it's just not the end of the story for me. Not unless you're making, I think, a lower grade movie. So the obvious answer was an afterlife.
I do think the seeds of this connection to Elysium were there. It was almost like too close for any of us to actually see. And which is why, you know, sometimes it takes that fresh set of eyes. It took Bill, having nothing to do with this, reading the script with no background whatsoever, to say, well, this is very interesting, but my Lord, this is rather depressing. He dies at the end. How can we possibly come up with something so that, you know, you feel that in his death he's achieved something?
We thread this through the movie so that his actual aim is to rejoin his beloved wife and child in the next life, and in that way, the act of dying becomes an act of winning, an act of triumph.
And almost like an archaeologist, an emotional archaeologist, he found the beginnings of all this in John's draft, this kind of sense of connection to the afterworld. But what was so brilliant was to decide to fully portray it, not just in dialogue, but actually visually. And of course, what that gave us, you know, as rendered by Ridley, was a hero's death at the end, which was, you know, as satisfying as a happy ending.
They got to the point where they realized they had to have the family at the end of the film, because the movie is, again, not a revenge film. It's about a man trying to get home. And if Maximus can't get home, the movie fails. So Ridley said, well, and on German front, he said, I'll do a long-distance phone call. So when Maximus is praying, you see the family. And it worked beautifully. And then they came up with the idea of the afterlife. And I thought at the time, if anybody can do it, Ridley can do it. And if he does, it's better than my original ending, because it'll be perfect or it'll stink. And of course, Ridley turned in an absolutely magnificent vision of a pagan afterlife, of Maximus returning home.
I then started to thread that right the way through from the beginning to create a character who, instead of being a soldier who becomes a killing machine, is somebody who doesn't want to be a soldier.
A1, take 5.
The first thing you ever see, I said, we've got, before the battle even starts, we've got to have a sense that this man doesn't want to be here. If you remember the business with the bird. There's lots of ways. I wrote in, even before the battle, when he's riding along, in the beginning of the battle, he says to his men, if you find you're in green fields, don't worry, you're dead. You're in Elysium. And by planting this all the way through, and I rebuilt all of the scenes with Juba so that we could play this theme all the way through, you realize this is a man who's pursuing the ultimate, really, which is transcending death and finding love after death, which completely transforms your reaction to the man. And it makes you love him, because he's not now killing because he's so big and tough. He's killing because he has to. My own belief, and I would say this, wouldn't I, is that because of all those changes I made to his character, he became appealing to women. He was always going to be appealing to men. He was always a great fighter. But there are so many movies of great, tough fighters that are only watched by 16-year-old boys. You know, Gladiator isn't like that. Gladiator has, I think, something like 50% of its audience is women. What they saw on screen was their dream man, a man who's very, very strong, but very, very loving.
Between the three writers who then would circulate, so John had burnout, Bill came in, he had burnout, went back to John, and we came back to Bill again. Franzoni is a producer on this, so he's actually just keeping an eye on how things go, because he knows in that area they're better at what they bring to bear than he is, so I think he was very cool about it.
It's not a case of me solving problems and me doing it all, or the other writers. It's this group focus that says we're getting closer all the time to understanding who our characters are and what they want to do. How can we make this absolutely perfect so nothing's going wrong, so everything follows on from everything else? And I couldn't tell you, looking through it, what's me and what's Doug and what's Walter and what's Ridley and what's John Logan and what's David Franzoni, what's Russell Crowe, because he's making suggestions as well. That's how films get made.
I think it was fairly handled, actually. You know, at the end of the day, you've got one thing in mind: how do I make this film the best we can possibly make it?
In that period, weapons were designed to do one thing and one thing only, and that was inflict a fatal wound. They were really vicious weapons. I mean, when you were out there for fighting for your life, there was none of this sort of rules. You were out to kill. Armour means that instead of making specifically suits of armour as such, and helmets, even though we've made a few, we've mainly dealt with the small arms, the side arms, the spears, the bows and the arrows, some crossbows, which you can see behind, and other assorted small weapons.
Yeah, we've got a totally different sort of viewpoint on war, and just because of the way society's developed, the way weapons have developed, you know. They have a very, guns are very objective, you know. You can be quite some distance away from somebody with a gun. A sword, which is just basically a large steak knife, you don't have that objectivity, you know. If you want to be successful in a short sword fight, then you are truly 100% involved. It was an extremely brutal life, but no more brutal, say, than Mike Tyson's professional life in the ring, or any number of football players you want to name, you know. That's the modern day equivalent.
You read a lot at the beginning of the film, and then rather than copy, you put all your books to one side and use that knowledge to create something different. I started to look through all the books, and there's not much information. There's not much for this period that's been kept. So it did give us a little bit of a free hand. There's a few examples that have been found of the correct armour. I think there's only about 3 Gladiator helmets that are in existence, so we've just played with it a little bit. The weapons that were used in that period were a spear that you could throw initially. The spears were called pilums, and they were quite a good design because it was made of a soft iron with a hard tip, and when you threw this thing it bent, meaning that the enemy couldn't throw it back to you. Once you'd thrown your spear, you'd advance with your shield and to defend yourself, pushing the enemy back or bowling them over, and then you would draw your sword, which is a gladius. It's called gladius, and I think that's where the word gladiators come from, a sword, a user of the sword. And you would then use that as a thrusting weapon mainly, even though you could cut with it. But the shield, the spear and the sword were the main weapons for the soldier.
Now imagine, the Roman army is stretched out. Their lines are a mile long. You have 5 lines, roughly 1,000 soldiers each. They're not next to each other. There's maybe 6 feet between them, enough room for another man to come between. The second line is stepped over so that they cover that gap. That means you have no one behind you, so when you draw back your spear to throw, you don't poke someone in the eye. The third line is behind you, but it's 12 feet back. Now, the enemy charge, crashing down towards these 5 thin lines of Roman soldiers who look just like fences before an avalanche. No fence is going to stand up to an avalanche, or are they? Because as they come within 30 yards, a trumpet sounds, back go the arms, and 1,000 javelins hit the enemy. Down they go, rolling over each other, men falling over them, men with spears stuck in their shields, throwing them aside. It's a shambles. And then out come the swords.
I mean, axes, as you see the scale of this axe, it was weighty and would have been made in either bronze or iron. It's quite barbarian style weapon. The Romans were really good at whoever they fought. If they thought they were good, they were like the Japanese of their day. They would take that technology and weaponry and utilize it. We had our bows made for us by a proper bow maker. I think it was in the region of 16,000 arrows just for the flaming ones, and then we went through 10,000 arrows for firing. We did the arrows in 4 days. The special effects had special machines that could launch batteries of them into the air at any one time. But our guys firing them by the conventional way weren't doing that bad either.
Apart from recreating the sense of authentic Roman army equipment, catapults and ballistas and scorpions, machines that fire incredible volleys of arrows and huge terracotta bombs filled with flaming oil on their unfortunate and rather poorly equipped enemies, which is how the Romans did it. That was all equipment that didn't exist. Almost everything had to be made from scratch and be practical.
No! 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 Archers! Ignite! Ignite!
A lot of the things in the arena were tested out. The army would test ways of fighting within the gladiatorial arena that they then might use in battle elsewhere. There was lots of different types of weapons that were used. Most of the people that fought, the gladiators that fought, had a specific way of fighting, and the crowd would follow that man and the way he fought. It's like being in the blue team or the red team. You would come each week to watch your gladiator fight in a specific way, and he would be put up against opponents that would fight in different ways, but he had to fight in his kind of traditional way. Retiarius would use a trident to fight with. He would also have a net. We had a bit of a problem in trying to figure out how you threw this net as well as holding the trident, but we've found a way around it. And our little net's got crabs inserted in it, so the little crabs grab hold of you and cling onto you. These guys would mainly fight somebody called a mammalian, who resembled a fish. He'd have a fish on his helmet, and it was like, you know, the fisherman going out to catch the fish. This is what we think is a Thracian sword. We're not really sure what the bend was for, but I think if somebody's approaching you, and you really know where the point is on a standard sword, not to know where it is. So any movement he does, you would find that you didn't know where it was coming from. So he had a slight advantage on you. We did see a sketch in a book of it. A lot of the references come off old statues, and there's a thing called the Trajan's Column, which gave us a lot of information.
Action, Jack, move your club to the left.
We have a character in the film who we see in the provincial theatre in Morocco, and he's Pluto. He comes out and he dispatches people to the afterlife. He wanders round, and if there's any gladiators laying on the floor looking like they're not going to make it, he'll use this to break their skulls or dispatch them to the afterlife.
Shut the gates, boys. Shut the gates. Family.
This is actually rubber, but it's meant to represent a large piece of bronze.
Good morning.
We were also asked to make a ball and chain, but I've made it a ball and leather. Sounds like an English pub. We've used a lot of soft bits and pieces so people can get really hit in the face and clobbered.
Action!
This sword we have here, we've made this one up. We're probably going to have a scene where somebody's pinned to the wall with their head in there, and one of our actors reaches across, grabs his hair and pulls him forward, thus decapitating him. But whether we'll go that far, I don't know. We've made a crossbow up here, even though this one didn't exist. The technology to make a crossbow was there. They're meant to represent Nubian archers, so they start off with this Nubian-style bow, and they let off about 4 or 5 arrows. And then as the chariots crash, you'll see them start to go for these crossbows, which are inside. Each chariot is meant to be like an armoured personnel carrier. Ridley's direction was that he wanted an Uzi-type weapon for one of the gladiators to use. So I played around a bit and made this. I couldn't even draw it. I had to make it to figure out how it worked. But it fires 4 arrows, or 4 bolts. You have to fire the top and bottom ones first before you can fire the outer ones. But it does work really well. It does throw them a few yards.
H camera marker.
We've got another character in the film called Tiger, who does some wonderful things with 4 tigers, but this is his sword. So we had to represent a tiger's eye and tiger claws all around here. Everything's looking a little bit weary because it's just come straight from being used. Within the Colosseum, the armoury department must have been quite large. I mean, it had complete areas underneath it where they would prepare. You'd have people working on animals, you'd have people preparing food. So the armoury section, I imagine, would have been very big. You've got the swords, you've got the sharpening of weapons, you've got breakages to service, you've got the whim of whoever's sponsoring the games that week because they want something different made. So I imagine there must have been a lot of armourers there trying to churn it all out.
This is the first production I had worked on which involved armour.
great bloody battles and thousands of legionaries coming over the top of a hill. I think one comes close to nervous breakdowns on most films. And admittedly, it was quite enormous on a daily basis. And then you just start thinking, oh, only 2,500 extras today. It's a light day.
Jan T. Yates has exquisite taste, and part of the challenge was to get the spirit of authenticity. And when you actually see certain Roman actual dress, there's certain things to our eye that sort of look like a toga party, or they seem strange or weird, and she was able to sort of translate them. She'd take the essence of them and find some way that they somehow still felt like what we thought royalty should look like. So she would do the research and still find something that looked right for the characters.
My first meeting with Ridley was very exciting because I was going for an audition, but after 2.5 hours we talked through the script and he talked through his visions, and it was as if one was sort of virtually totally involved in the film and one had only spent an afternoon with him. Looking back on the epics of yore, we really wanted to get away from that look on Gladiator. We wanted to ensure that everything looked very worn, and so the breaking down department was very, very important to us. We also wanted to make sure that the armour looked very battered and old. We wanted to make all the legionaries look as if they'd lived in their armour for 4 years, which they did, that they hardly washed. One of Ridley's images was that these legionaries should look like Vietnam vets, i.e. they should virtually have a Marlboro packet tucked into their tunics, and their helmets had graffiti on them. It was that sort of feel. We wanted it to be grungy, we wanted it to be gritty and earthy, we wanted rust on the armour, we wanted verdigris, we wanted it. Ridley has a wonderful word, gnarly. Everything pitted, aged, and the same with the tunics, the same with the soft texture fabrics, to be as aged and as broken down as possible. Skins to be old and slept in, greasy, just really getting it as authentic looking as we possibly could.
You look back at the classic Gladiator movies, and oddly enough, there's some great writing and there's some wonderful actors involved, and the thing that really makes them feel cheesy is the way they look, and particularly the costumes. There's just a kind of thin, nothing looks worn, nothing really looks real. It all seems kind of like often a high school play. Just the truth of wearing sandals and a toga, it's tough. And part of the excitement about going to Ridley, beyond all the other, skills, is just the man's taste.
Also, we wanted to get away from the short skirt department. So we took the image of a Scotsman's kilt for the length of most of the tunics and lengths of body armour. So there wasn't all this tiny little ballerina tutu effect, and it looked, I think, much more effective. It was an enormous history lesson, and really all you can do with any period is research, research, research. You go straight to the British Museum, and then you go straight into the libraries, and then you go straight to the bookshops, and then you go straight to Rome, and you walk around all the columns and all the statues, and you go as far afield as you possibly can to learn as much as you possibly can. We were lucky that we had 6 months preparation. So because everything had to be made, from the smallest of buckles all the way through to the largest of armour sets, everything had to be made. All our crowd had to be made. So everything had to be in process from the first 2 or 3 months. The script evolved, but we always knew that we would have to costume up to 3,000 extras at a time, some military, some civilian. So we always knew we had to get a chain gang, we had to get manufacture on board, and we always knew that the fights were going to happen. So we could always work towards the specific set pieces of the fights. So we went up a lot of dead ends trying to find an armour that would be light enough and malleable enough to wear for the thousands of legionaries. Also, good paint finishes, so it looked like the Royal McCoy, even adding bits of rust and verdigris as well. So we ended up using nearly every material because we had aluminium, we had rubber insofar as car bumper rubber that was malleable and light. It's what we made most of the armour out of. And we did have some foam and we did have some fiberglass. And we did have a tiny bit of metal, but just thrown in here and there on the mercenaries and things like that. And of course, lots of leather. I had one specific fabulous armourer for Russell's armour and his team, Ivo Coveney. Then FB Effects took on an awful lot of the bulk making. When we shot Germania, we were shooting in Hampshire in a forest which had been deforested. But when Ridley wanted snow, it snowed. It was quite extraordinary. We were up to our ears in mud, and everybody was up to their ears in mud and snow, which turned into slush. But that's exactly how Ridley wanted his legionaries. It's exactly how he wanted his barbarians. So everyone was happy.